Florence in the 1400s wasn't ruled by kings or soldiers. It was ruled by bankers. In its bustling streets and marble palaces, power overflowed not from swords, but from ledgers. And no name carried more weight than Medici. But how did one family, starting from a modest wool business, come to control popes, monarchs, and the very currency of Europe? This is not just the story about art and architecture. It's a story about money, power, and genius. The Medici invented financial systems so advanced they quietly rewired the economy of the Renaissance, funded the birth of modern banking, and transformed the church's relationship with wealth forever. Their rise would spark rivalries, revolutions, and a cultural explosion that still shapes our world today. This is the story of the Medici, the dynasty that turned Florence into the heart of the Renaissance. The Medici story begins far from the palaces and galleries that would one day bear their name. In the rugged countryside of Mugello, a small valley north of Florence, the family lived as minor landowners around the end of the 13th century. Mugello was a quiet place of farmers, artisans, and modest trade. From these provincial beginnings, the Medici line grew, taking its name from the Italian word for doctors, a likely reference to ancestors who practiced medicine or apothecary work. At the time, such a profession carried respectability but no promise of wealth or political sway. Yet the combination of education, precision, and public trust that marked their early trade foreshadowed the approach that would later define their entire dynasty. As the 1300s unfolded, Florence emerged as one of Europe's most vibrant and complex city-states. It was a republic in name, ruled by an intricate network of councils and guilds rather than hereditary nobles. Prosperity came through banking, wool production, and maritime commerce rather than conquest. For families like the Medici, the city offered opportunities unavailable to the rural aristocracy. By joining the powerful wool guild, the Arte della Lana, the family inserted itself into Florence's economic heart. Their initial business centered on processing and trading cloth, a trade that relied on reliability, negotiation, and reputation. In a society where a handshake could affect fortunes as much as a written contract, trust was currency. Florence's atmosphere, however, was driven by both collaboration and rivalry. Long-standing feuds divided neighborhoods, and powerful families like the Albizzi and the Strozzi fought for dominance through commercial monopolies and strategic marriages. Each household guarded its client networks with intensity, and a single financial misstep could trigger social collapse. The Medici, lacking noble lineage, learned to navigate this volatile environment through discretion. Rather than flaunting wealth, they projected humility and reliability, earning clients who valued stability over prestige. This understated approach differentiated them from the city's more ostentatious elites and allowed them to survive the political storms that frequently toppled bolder players. Averardo de' Medici, the father of Giovanni de' Bicci, the man who would later shape the family's golden era, made the calculated decision to invest in banking. At the time, Florentine banks were rapidly expanding across Europe, financing trade routes that linked London, Bruges, and Rome. Banking offered immense profit, but also carried heavy risk. Entire companies vanished overnight due to wars or unpaid royal debts. Averardo's cautious ventures created the foundation that his son would later refine. The Medici learned that influence in Florence did not depend on swords or titles, but on liquidity and trust. In a republic built on collective power, control of money meant quiet authority. Their rise coincided with a cultural transformation spreading across northern Italy. Humanist scholars celebrated the study of classical antiquity, and Florence became both muse and marketplace for new ideas. The Medici's growing capital, positioned them at the intersection of ideology and commerce. Their donations to churches, hospitals, and local charities reinforced their image as civic benefactors, masking ambitions for long-term influence. This balance of virtue and calculation became a defining trait of Medici's strategy for generations. The family crest began appearing more frequently during this period, a golden shield marked with a cluster of red spheres. To the Florentines, these pallae symbolized distinctive identity, recognizable from workshops to government halls. Myths soon amplified its prestige. One story claimed a dent left by Emperor Charlemagne's sword inspired one of the red circles, suggesting the family's ancient and noble origin. Whether true or not, the legends showcased their early mastery of public narrative, turning heraldry into a tool of legitimacy. By the early 1400s, the Medici name carried weight beyond textile ledgers. They possessed resources broad enough to influence civic loans, sponsor chapels, and engage in large-scale financial operations. What began in the valleys of Mugello had evolved into a network capable of shaping the economic pulse of Florence. The dynasty was no longer a family of traders, but an emerging force in European finance, quietly preparing for a century of unparalleled ascendancy. At the dawn of the 15th century, Florence stood as one of Europe's most prosperous and self-assured republics. The streets were crowded with merchants, bankers, and artisans who treated trade as both craft and contest. The city's ruling structure rested not on hereditary kings, but on an intricate system of elected councils. Every few months, new officials were drawn by lot to form the Signoria, a rotating government that represented Florence's guilds. In theory, this ensured balance. In practice, family alliances and backroom bargains determined who held office. A man's fortune, reputation, and the number of allies he could count among the guilds mattered more than civic theory. In this uncertain climate, power was fluid, earned rather than inherited, and that made Florence unique in an age dominated by monarchs. Florence's wealth flowed from an economy built on cloth and coin. Skilled laborers spun raw wool into luxury fabric, which merchants exported across the continent. Banking grew in parallel with the textile trade, handling credit, loans, and large-scale transactions that allowed Florentines to fund expeditions and trading companies. The city's gold coin, the florin, became Europe's preferred currency, accepted from the North Sea ports to the courts of Constantinople. Its reliability gave Florence a global reach far beyond its modest size. Ships entering Italian harbors carried silk from the East, dyes from the Levant, and silver from Germany, all priced in florins. For the families who financed these ventures, banking was both profit and power. Controlling money meant deciding whose ventures succeeded. Politics and finance worked as two sides of the same system. The guilds, meant to protect artisans and traders, gradually became vehicles for elite control. Families like the Albizzi, the Strozzi, and later the Medici treated public offices as investments. Patronage, the exchange of favors, loans, or appointments, governed political life. Success required discretion. Outright corruption could backfire in a republic that glorified civic virtue. Yet, every building project and every public festival quietly reinforced which faction held influence. For ambitious families without aristocratic ancestry, the city's mercantile government offered an open door. Money replaced bloodline as the key to entry, allowing skilled financiers to eclipse the old noble houses. This openness created a constant churn of competition, turning Florence into a laboratory for social mobility. Religion intertwined naturally with commerce. The church owned lands and required financing for wars, pilgrimages, and cathedrals. Florentine bankers learned to handle ecclesiastical funds, transforming spiritual obligation into economic opportunity. Lending money at interest remained controversial under canon law, but creative accounting, service fees, and currency exchange made it acceptable. This moral compromise blurred lines between devotion and profit, creating an alliance between throne, altar, and ledger. A banker who could win papal trust gained access to the most secure client in Europe. Despite its prosperity, Florence was rarely peaceful. The same rivalry that fueled innovation also bred resentment. Streets could erupt in factional violence, and exile awaited families who fell from favor. Artisan workshops stood beside palaces fortified like castles, reminders that artistic talent and political ambition lived side by side. Paradox defined the city: immense creativity amid deep instability, civic freedom built on economic control. Yet this volatile environment rewarded talent and risk more than tradition. A clever merchant could become a statesman, and a banker might shape the destiny of empires. For the Medici, Florence's mix of liberty, wealth, and danger created the perfect arena. Their challenge was to master its rules, use its networks, and transform opportunity into dynastic permanence. As trade expanded and Florence's name echoed across Europe, Giovanni de Bicci de' Medici prepared to use this restless city as the platform for a financial revolution that would reach across the continent. Giovanni de' Bicci de' Medici was born in 1360 into a family that had gained local footing in Florence's wool trade but was still far from power. He grew up in a city where fortunes could rise or collapse within a season, and he studied carefully how others gained influence. When he inherited a small banking operation, he set out to strengthen it not through speculation or ostentation, but through discipline. He applied arithmetic precision to every account and treated reputation as capital. In a trade that depended on trust, attention to detail could mean the difference between solvency and ruin. Those who dealt with Giovanni found him measured in speech and deliberate in judgment, qualities that won him both clients and discretion. Florence's economy relied heavily on confidence, and Giovanni understood that banks thrived when people believed their money was safe. He avoided loans to princes who might default, steering clear of the dangerous politics that had bankrupted rival houses. Instead, he built modest but steady partnerships across Europe. Branches of the Medici Bank appeared in the commercial centers of Venice, Rome, and Geneva, later extending to London and Bruges. These outposts created one of the earliest organized financial networks in the Western world. A merchant in England could deposit funds there and withdraw them in Italy through letters of credit, a system that reduced the need to transport gold across hostile borders. The reliability of these instruments made the Medici name synonymous with security. Rome became the most strategic branch. By offering careful financial management to the papal court, Giovanni gained what every banker desired: the trust of the church. The Medici Bank handled large papal accounts, managing collections and payments that reached across Christendom. This contract yielded enormous profit, but Giovanni presented it as service rather than conquest. He framed success in moral language, claiming that sound finance meant civic duty. That posture helped him navigate Florence's Republican sensibilities, where public sympathy still leaned against overt displays of greed or excess. Even as wealth accumulated, Giovanni cultivated austerity. His home remained relatively simple, and his clothing signaled restraint rather than rank. In speeches before guild members, he emphasized diligence and piety, presenting himself as a servant of the city. Behind this humility was strategic awareness. Open arrogance could provoke jealousy in a community where rival families watched every transaction. His careful demeanor embodied an ethical code he later urged his sons to follow: avoid arrogance, preserve humility, and never provoke envy. The phrase became an unofficial motto of Medici practice, blending prudence with quiet control. Giovanni's financial sense extended beyond balance sheets. He lent generously to civic projects, repairing roads, sponsoring religious festivals, and supporting charities. These gestures built goodwill and positioned his family as benefactors of public life. One such effort involved providing funds that helped sustain the work on Florence's cathedral dome, an architectural enterprise that symbolized both faith and civic pride. Though the Medici name did not yet crown its facade, the family's resources ensured that the project endured through financial uncertainty. This connection wove their legacy into the city's most visible monument. When Giovanni died in 1429, Florence had already begun to orbit his influence. Through prudence and credibility, he transformed a modest enterprise into Europe's most powerful financial network. The Medici Bank served merchants, monarchs, and popes alike, creating an invisible structure of dependence around the city's political institutions. Giovanni left behind not a throne or an army, but a mechanism for control so stable that his descendants could rule Florence without ever claiming to rule it outright. His reserved style became the template for a dynasty that learned to govern by credit rather than decree. Cosimo de' Medici was born in 1389 into a household already touched by wealth but guided by restraint. His father, Giovanni de' Bicci, had instilled in him a method for survival in Florence's unstable republic: stay quiet, build alliances, and let others speak your name. Cosimo absorbed that approach, yet understood that money alone could not sustain power. What he inherited was not only a bank, but a network dependent on confidence. He recognized that influence in Florence required subtle organization, placing partners, clients, and friends where they could act without overt display. From his early years, he combined financial precision with the patience of a man studying the city's rhythms before shaping them. When Giovanni died in 1429, Cosimo assumed control of both family and fortune. The Medici Bank at that point handled accounts from across Europe, financing trade ventures and papal expenses alike. Cosimo saw opportunity in consolidation rather than expansion for its own sake. Under his direction, every branch operated with strict accountability, and the profits were reinvested through loans to merchants and governments. These transactions created dependency. Those indebted to the Medici rarely opposed them in council. Within a few years, Florence's commercial class found itself tied to Cosimo's success, and his voice carried weight in every major decision. Yet his influence remained informal, forming through personal loyalty rather than decrees. The city's ruling elite, especially the Albizzi family, viewed such leverage as a threat to Republican balance. In 1433, they used their control of the Signoria to accuse Cosimo of manipulating the state. He was imprisoned in the Palazzo Vecchio, awaiting a political trial that could have ended his career or his life. Cosimo's response reflected the trained caution of a banker. Through intermediaries, he secured his safety with payments and promises, ensuring that those who judged him also owed him. Exile to Venice replaced execution, and while away, he used negotiation to strengthen alliances. The following year, when political winds shifted, Florence called him back. Crowds welcomed his return, and the Albizzi faction was quietly removed from power. From that moment forward, the Republic operated under his design, officially a government of elected citizens, unofficially a system balanced on Medici confidence. Cosimo governed through patience and patronage rather than command. He funded public projects that gave visible proof of prosperity while allowing others to claim credit. Churches, monasteries, and hospitals bore the mark of his assistance. Among them, the Church of San Lorenzo became his favored commission, rebuilt with a sense of proportion that mirrored his political philosophy, order disguised as simplicity. He sponsored libraries and financed translations of Greek manuscripts, acts that tied his family's name to culture rather than mere profit. Architects and artists found in him a steady sponsor who valued continuity as much as beauty. His palace, designed by Michelangelo, avoided excess, presenting an image of solidity that reassured the public. Cosimo's home became a meeting point for scholars and humanists. Men like Marsilio Ficino gathered there, discussing philosophy while shaping the thought that came to define the Florentine Renaissance. These associations extended Medici power into the intellectual sphere, aligning wealth with wisdom. Even at the height of influence, Cosimo traveled the streets without guards and referred to himself as a citizen of Florence. Such modest presentation concealed the reality that every major civic decision passed, directly or indirectly, through his network. When he died in 1464, the city buried him with honors seldom given to private men, inscribing him as Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland, a merchant who had become the quiet architect of Florence's age of brilliance. Under Cosimo de' Medici's leadership, Florence evolved from a commercial republic into the intellectual center of Europe. Trade and finance funded its prosperity, but art defined its identity. Cosimo recognized that commissioning architecture and sculpture could express civic legitimacy as effectively as any decree. In a republic without monarchs, grandeur had to appear shared, not imposed. Public buildings, churches, and monuments became symbols of stability and faith in the city's collective destiny. Every artistic project served a dual purpose, enriching Florence's cultural life and reinforcing Medici influence. Patronage was a form of investment, measured not only in gold but in the loyalty it generated among citizens and the gratitude it inspired across Europe. The transformation of Florence's skyline began with Filippo Brunelleschi, a goldsmith turned architect whose ingenuity solved the greatest technical puzzle of the 15th century. When work on the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore stalled, Brunelleschi devised an innovative system of interlocking ribs that allowed a massive dome to be built without external scaffolding. Construction began under his supervision, backed by Medici funds and civic determination. The completed structure became a statement of Florentine skill and divine favor, a symbol that resonated well beyond Tuscany. Its vast scale and mathematical precision revealed how art and engineering could merge into a single pursuit of perfection. Even centuries later, the geometry of the dome continued to intrigue architects, its precise methods still studied but never fully replicated. Cosimo understood that such monuments elevated more than the builders. They immortalized the patrons who enabled them. He commissioned Michelangelo di Bartolomeo to design the Palazzo Medici, a residence that defined a new urban aesthetic. Its restrained stone facade avoided aristocratic excess, projecting authority through balance and proportion. The building's design, with its open courtyard and harmonious arcades, embodied the ideals of human order that Renaissance thinkers celebrated. Everyone who passed its gates could read its message, that power, when moderated by intellect and civic duty, could align with the city's ideals. The palace stood not as a fortress, but as a blueprint for the modern home of civic-minded leadership. The Medici also transformed their parish church, San Lorenzo, into a model of Renaissance architecture. Brunelleschi's design replaced medieval complexity with clear lines and measured geometry, flooding the interior with light. Each proportion followed mathematical ratios that reflected the belief in a universe governed by reason. Within these walls, tombs, and chapels bearing the Medici name reminded worshippers that faith and family honor were intertwined. Artworks commissioned for the church further reinforced this link between spirituality and public virtue, turning a space of devotion into an emblem of Florence's artistic rebirth. While architecture reshaped space, sculpture and painting gave voice to human emotion. Donatello's Bronze David, created under Medici patronage, revived the classical tradition of the freestanding nude, a civic symbol of intelligence triumphing over brute strength. Fra Angelico's frescoes, supported by Medici funds, filled convent walls with luminous narratives that combined humility with deep psychological insight. Each work extended Florence's reputation as a center of innovation and revealed the family's understanding that beauty could unify a fragmented society. By mid-century, Florence functioned as a living gallery. Workshops, guild halls, and private chapels displayed the results of Medici's sponsorship, drawing artists and scholars from across Europe. These visitors carried Florentine ideals to their homelands, spreading the principles of proportion, perspective, and human dignity that defined Renaissance thought. Behind every commission lay strategy. Art softened political rivalries, created employment, and celebrated civic unity. The Medici used aesthetics as diplomacy, projecting harmony in a city often divided by faction. Through architecture and art, they translated wealth into legacy, ensuring that Florence's prosperity was not measured solely in coin, but in lasting cultural achievement. Florence in the mid-15th century was a city of brilliance and unease. Behind the painted walls and marble facades lay a republic divided by competing ambitions. The system of government, founded on the Signoria and its rotating councils, looked democratic on the surface. Yet each election was shaped by patronage, wealth, and quiet coercion. A handful of powerful households created the republic's machinery as their own investment. Every decision, from trade policy to war alliances, turned into an opportunity to strengthen private influence. The Medici operated within this environment not as lords, but as careful navigators. Their power came through persuasion rather than decree, by shaping outcomes rather than declaring ownership of them. The Albizzi family had long dominated Florence's civic offices when Cosimo de' Medici began gathering loyal clients around him. Their rivalry set the tone for generations of Florentine politics. The Albizzi claimed to protect Republican virtue, accusing the Medici of monarchical ambition. The Medici defended their reputation by funding festivals, restoring public buildings, and forgiving debts. Their success was less a matter of ideology than arithmetic. Cosimo's control of capital allowed him to distribute small but decisive loans across the guilds and merchant circles. Many of those recipients later found themselves voting in his favor or depending on his network for stability. The Albizzi relied on lineage. The Medici built relationships measured in credit and gratitude. Other families joined the competition for influence. The Strozzi, known for their immense fortune, sought to regain the authority they had lost after earlier conflicts with the Medici. The Pazzi and Ridolfi alternated between alliance and opposition, calculating which faction could better protect their trading privileges. Marriage linked these rival clans in a web so complex that business and kinship could not be separated. Each new alliance promised security while simultaneously provoking new hostilities. Behind polite diplomacy, Florence became a battlefield of accounting ledgers, dowries, and shifting loyalties. Beneath elite politics, bankers, and guild leaders engaged in manipulation that blurred distinction between civic duty and personal benefit. Clergymen used their influence from the pulpit, shaping public opinion with sermons about virtue and corruption. Information moved quietly through the city's taverns, convents, and artist workshops. Rumors could damage reputations faster than official decrees. To remain ahead, the Medici relied on informants who tracked discussion not only in Florence, but across the Italian peninsula. Letters encoded with subtle language passed between their agents in Rome, Venice, and Milan. Every word mattered, as misunderstandings could cost fortunes. While managing domestic intrigue, Cosimo steered Florence through the rivalry of Italy's competing states. The fragile balance among Milan, Venice, and Naples offered both danger and opportunity. Cosimo preferred neutrality, enabling Florence to profit from the wars of others. Medici loans financed armies and rebuilt towns regardless of which side prevailed. This approach expanded their reach without risking open confrontation. It also positioned Florence as an indispensable broker, trusted intermediary in an unstable landscape. Power in Florence depended on maintaining appearances. Citizens gathered in public squares to debate liberty and governance, unaware that many policies were finalized in private courtyards. The illusion of equality kept unrest at bay. Even critics of the Medici admitted that stability under their guidance ensured economic prosperity. When Cosimo was briefly exiled, Florence's trade network faltered within months, confirming how deeply his system had penetrated civic life. Writers and thinkers later examined this network as proof that influence could outlast official authority. Niccolò Machiavelli, observing the political legacy the Medici left behind, studied Florence's tangled alliances as a living demonstration of practical power. By the mid-15th century, the city stood prosperous but tense. Behind its brilliance, unspoken rivalries awaited their next turning point, paving the way for a new leader who would transform Medici influence into open dominance: Lorenzo de' Medici, remembered as the Magnificent. Lorenzo de' Medici was born in 1449, the grandson of Cosimo, into a city already shaped by his family's discretion and wealth. The household he grew up in valued scholarship and civic duty as much as commerce. From an early age, Lorenzo displayed a natural talent for leadership and diplomacy. When his father died, he inherited control of both the Medici Bank and Florence's delicate political network. At only 20, he stepped into a position that required restraint, confidence, and a rare ability to balance civic ideals with personal authority. Florence remained a republic, but in reality, Lorenzo guided it much like a modern state, ensuring that political factions stayed contained while maintaining a facade of collective governance. His generation viewed him as the embodiment of Renaissance humanism. Lorenzo studied philosophy, wrote poetry, and engaged regularly with scholars of mathematics and the sciences. While holding political power, he cultivated the personality of a thinker rather than a tyrant. His home became a cultural nexus where ideas, art, and politics met. Foreign envoys often found him discussing theology one moment and currency policy the next. His charm served as a diplomatic tool. Foreign ambassadors trusted his word even when his influence extended into their own cities. By combining intellect and charisma, Lorenzo made Florence the most admired republic in Italy, wealthy, educated, and quietly controlled by one family. His patronage reshaped European art. He recognized early talent in local painters and sculptors, offering them steady commissions that freed them from dependence on guild wages. Under his direction, the Medici household supported artists like Sandro Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, and a young Michelangelo Buonarroti. Their works reflected the new values of human dignity and rational beauty. Botticelli's paintings, such as Primavera and The Birth of Venus, created mythological harmony over medieval symbolism, reflecting a return to classical ideals that had been dormant for centuries. Lorenzo funded libraries for scholars translating ancient texts, ensuring that the moral and aesthetic principles of Greece and Rome informed the art and architecture of his time. In doing so, he linked his name indelibly to Florence's creative transformation. Politics remained his most demanding craft. Italy during Lorenzo's time was a mosaic of powerful city-states whose shifting alliances constantly risked erupting into wars. Milan, Venice, Naples, and the Papal States balanced each other through treaties that could dissolve overnight. Lorenzo preserved Florence's independence not through armies, but through negotiation. He used strategic marriages and financial aid to keep rivals aligned with his interests. When tensions with Naples threatened invasion, he personally traveled to meet King Ferrante, securing peace through persuasion rather than force. This ability to convert potential disaster into alliance reinforced his reputation as the most capable statesman in Italy. At home, he faced growing resentment from Florentines who feared that hereditary power endangered Republican freedom. The ceremonial offices of government still functioned, but real authority rested with Lorenzo's private council. His expenditures on festivals, public art, and civic celebrations created jobs and loyalty, yet they also drained the Medici fortune. The bank, strained by costly patronage and imprudent loans abroad, began showing losses near the end of his life. Despite these financial risks, his leadership preserved Florence's cultural prominence and political stability. Lorenzo died in 1492, leaving behind both admiration and unease. The city he ruled had prospered under his steady hand, and many feared what would follow without his mediation. Even his former adversaries acknowledged that the balance of Italy's peace had rested largely on his diplomacy. In the years after his death, that peace collapsed, proving how completely he had personified the system he built. By the late 1470s, Lorenzo de' Medici's dominance over Florence had reached an extent that few could ignore. His control of politics, finance, and diplomacy made him a central figure in the Republic, admired by citizens who benefited from prosperity and resented by rivals who saw his influence as tyranny in disguise. Among those rivals stood the Pazzi family, wealthy bankers with deep roots in the city's economic life. For years, they had watched the Medici eclipse their prominence and monopolize every major financial relationship, including those with the papacy. When Pope Sixtus IV and his nephew, Girolamo Riario, sought to expand papal territory, Lorenzo's refusal to fund their acquisition of Imola created new tension. Feeling humiliated and obstructed, the Pope turned to the Pazzi, who were eager to reclaim power and weaken Medici dominance. The resulting conspiracy joined powerful interests across Italy. The Pazzi believed that removing Lorenzo and his younger brother Giuliano would destabilize Florence overnight, allowing them to seize government offices before the Medici loyalists could react. With papal approval and the promise of outside support, the plan evolved from rumor to detailed choreography. Weapons were acquired under the guise of ceremonial preparation, and assassins were placed where the brothers were expected to appear. The chosen moment carried both opportunity and gravity. Easter Sunday, April 26, 1478, during High Mass at the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore. The vast space promised confusion, and the presence of clergy masked the conspirators' intent. That morning, the cathedral was filled with Florence's leading citizens. As the sacred host was lifted, signaling the height of the ceremony, the attackers lunged. Giuliano, surrounded and unarmed, was struck repeatedly and died within moments. Lorenzo, though wounded, managed to defend himself long enough for supporters to escort him into the nearby sacristy. They barricaded the heavy wooden doors while chaos spread through the nave. Within minutes, news of the assault reached the crowd outside, and panic turned into anger. Bells rang across the city as citizens gathered, uncertain whether a coup or foreign invasion had begun. Florence's reaction was swift and unified. Members of the government, many indebted to the Medici, declared the Pazzi traitors. The conspirators who remained in the city were hunted down. Killing them became a public affirmation of loyalty. Francesco de' Pazzi and Archbishop Francesco Salviati were captured and executed without trial, hanged from the windows of the Palazzo Vecchio as onlookers filled the square. The display offered grim assurance that Florence still belonged to the Medici. Within hours, the uprising that sought to depose Lorenzo had instead destroyed one of the city's oldest families. The Pazzi palaces were seized, their family crest erased from public stones, and their memory condemned by decree. Pope Sixtus IV responded with fury, excommunicating Lorenzo and placing Florence under interdict, a spiritual sanction that threatened to paralyze its trade and worship. Allied papal and Neapolitan forces began preparations for war, yet Lorenzo refused to yield control of the city to panic. In a bold move, he traveled personally to Naples to meet King Ferrante, a monarch known for ruthlessness. Through persuasion and diplomacy, Lorenzo secured peace without yielding territory or paying tribute. His composure during crisis turned him from a civic leader into a national figure. When Lorenzo de' Medici died in 1492, Florence lost the careful balance that had protected it through decades of rivalry and external pressure. His government had kept peace between Italy's competing powers, maintained Florence's independence, and shielded the city from foreign exploitation. His death left a void that demanded both skill and restraint to fill. The leadership passed to his eldest son, Piero de' Medici, who was 21 and unprepared for the weight of responsibility that came with his inheritance. Piero possessed confidence and noble bearing, but lacked his father's judgment and measured diplomacy. The city's political factions, long restrained by Lorenzo's influence, grew restless, while abroad, Europe's military and economic landscape shifted toward open competition for dominance in Italy. By the early 1490s, the peninsula was a patchwork of small but wealthy states that had depended for years on fragility and mutual dependence to prevent war. The death of Lorenzo coincided with growing ambition across the borders. In France, King Charles VIII saw an opportunity to revive his country's old claim to the Kingdom of Naples, a campaign that would require marching directly through Tuscany. The Italian states hesitated to resist. Milan invited the French king to advance southward in order to weaken Naples, unaware that the move would shatter the balance of power that had kept Italy relatively stable for half a century. When Charles VIII crossed the Alps in 1494, tens of thousands of troops followed him, an organized force larger and more heavily armed than any Italy had faced since antiquity. Town after town surrendered or opened its gates. As the French army approached Florence, panic gripped the Republic's leaders. Rather than assemble resistance, Piero chose negotiation without consultation. Seeking to protect his property and position, he met the king and offered the keys to Florence's fortresses, along with hostages and much of the city's riches. The arrangement avoided immediate conflict, but destroyed his standing at home. To the citizens, it appeared that Piero had submitted their independence for personal safety. When news of his concessions reached Florence, outrage followed. Crowds filled the streets, demanding accountability. The people who had once trusted the Medici as guardians of stability now viewed them as traitors. Mobs stormed the family's palace, emptied its vaults, and tore down Medici symbols from public buildings. The Signoria declared Piero unfit to rule, and within days he fled the city with his brothers and loyal retainers. Exile turned him into a wandering figure, stripped of wealth and allies. Dynasty that had set the course of Florence's prosperity collapsed in weeks. With the Medici gone, the Republic re-established its institutions and embraced a new spirit of reform. Into this unsettled atmosphere stepped the Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola. His sermons spoke of divine judgment and the corruption that had stained Florence's soul under the Medici. Crowds filled the cathedral to hear him denounce greed, luxury, and moral decay. He promised that Florence could become a model of Christian renewal if it rejected material excess and returned to spiritual discipline. Under his influence, the city transformed its civic pride into religious fervor, dismantling many of the Renaissance ideals that had defined it under Lorenzo. The Medici family scattered across Italy, some seeking service under foreign rulers, others living quietly with diminished fortune. Legend later claimed that when Piero fled Florence, he attempted to carry gold hidden inside statues, only to lose part of it when a storm overturned his boat on the Arno River. Whether true or not, the story symbolized the family's sudden misfortune. Within a single generation, the bankers who had shaped European finance and patronized genius found themselves dispossessed, uncertain if their name would ever return to Florence's walls or its government. When the Medici were driven from Florence, authority passed not to another banking house or merchant alliance, but to a Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola. He arrived from Ferrara years earlier as a preacher known for uncompromising sermons. Now, amid economic uncertainty and moral anxiety, his message resonated. He declared that Florence had been chosen by God as the instrument of spiritual renewal in a corrupt world. To achieve this destiny, the city had to cast off pride, luxury, and worldliness. Many citizens who had once admired Lorenzo's adornment of Florence began to view those same achievements as symbols of sin. Religious processions replaced festivals, and sermons replaced musical performances in the main squares. Savonarola's power rested on charisma and fear in equal measure. Standing in the pulpit of San Marco and later in the cathedral, he spoke for hours, denouncing the excess of rulers and clergy alike. He targeted the Medici by name, accusing them of turning Florence into a nest of vanity and greed. Under his influence, the city's republican institutions took on a new form. The councils were recast as moral assemblies, guided by scriptural law rather than mercantile opportunity. In place of Medici patronage, he introduced the structure of a theocratic republic, claiming political authority derived from divine commission. Citizens were urged to adopt lives of simplicity, no gambling, no extravagant banquets, no ornaments that reflected pride. The young formed neighborhood watches to enforce virtue, visiting houses and shops to collect objects associated with vice. By early 1497, the movement reached its symbolic height. In the Piazza della Signoria, the wide civic space that had once hosted tournaments and parades, Savonarola organized what became known as the Bonfire of the Vanities. Citizens carried mirrors, perfumes, playing cards, and fine clothes to the square. Artists and booksellers brought canvases and manuscripts considered indecent or pagan. When the flames rose, they consumed goods worth fortunes. Contemporary accounts suggest that even works by respected painters were lost, pieces that reflected Renaissance curiosity about mythology and sensuality. The spectacle marked a reversal of everything Florence had represented under Medici rule. A city praised for celebrating human brilliance now sought redemption through destruction. For a time, this moral republic seemed unshakable. Savonarola's confidence grew as his following enlarged. He predicted divine signs that would confirm his vision of a purified Florence blessed by heaven. But his rule soon met resistance from those who had first supported him. Merchants watched foreign trade suffer under restrictions against luxury goods. Scholars resented censorship of secular texts. Ordinary citizens, tired of austerity, began to miss the vibrancy of the Florence they had surrendered. When Savonarola attacked the corruption of Pope Alexander VI, the situation escalated beyond Florence's control. The pontiff responded with excommunication, cutting the friar off from the church he claimed to serve. In 1498, after failed prophecies and several outbreaks of civil unrest, the Republican councils revoked his protection. Savonarola was arrested, interrogated under torture, and condemned with two of his closest followers. On a morning in May, he was hanged and burned in the Piazza della Signoria, the same space where the bonfire had consumed Florence's treasures the year before. The ashes of the preacher who sought to purify the city were scattered in the Arno River, ending the brief experiment in theocracy. Today, a small circular plaque marks the site of his execution. Tourists often walk across it without pause, unaware that beneath their feet lay the center of a revolution that for 4 years tried to trade beauty for holiness. Florence, exhausted by unrest, would soon look once more to the Medici to restore the stability it had lost. When Savonarola's fiery rule collapsed in 1498, Florence entered a restless age. Governments rose and disintegrated in quick succession, each one promising stability and delivering chaos. Republican councils argued endlessly, foreign armies marched through Tuscany, and Florence's claim to independence shrank with every new crisis. In exile, scattered across Rome, Venice, and even France, the Medici family watched closely. They had lost everything once, but their network of bankers, clergy, and allies remained intact. That network slowly began to tighten around a single figure, Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, the second son of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Giovanni had grown up in the shadow of Florence's golden age and carried both its prestige and its scars. Educated in the church from a young age, he maneuvered through the papal courts with patience his father would have admired. As Florence struggled to keep its fragile republic alive, Giovanni found opportunity in Rome. He built friendships with powerful cardinals, aligned himself with the ambitions of Pope Julius II, and quietly bided his time while foreign kings fought to divide Italy. By 1512, circumstance finally turned in his favor. That year, Spanish troops loyal to the Pope marched into Tuscany under the banner of restoring order. Behind this military front stood Medici diplomacy. Through promises of stability and religious alignment with Rome, Giovanni persuaded both Julius II and Spain's Ferdinand of Aragon that Florence's republican experiment had become a threat to Italian unity. The campaign was swift. In the late summer of 1512, Medici loyalists entered Florence without widespread destruction, striking contrast to earlier upheavals. The Republic collapsed, and Giuliano de' Medici, Giovanni's younger brother, rode into the city at the head of a ceremonial procession. For many Florentines, that day marked a familiar rhythm returning. They watched banners bearing the Medici insignia cross the Piazza della Signoria, recalling the order and prosperity of Lorenzo's time. Publicly, the brothers vowed not to restore tyranny, but to safeguard religion, commerce, and civic peace. Behind this image of moderation, the family worked with precision. Former Republican officials were quietly removed or reassigned. Medici loyalists took key offices in finance, trade, and city defense, ensuring that influence flowed through familiar channels once again. Florence, weary of constant turmoil, accepted the trade, stability in exchange for freedom that had never felt secure. The Medici also knew that healing their image required more than power. They turned again to art, education, and religion, funding the repair of churches damaged during the years of unrest. Scholarships reopened at the University of Florence, drawing new scholars inspired by the city's earlier Renaissance glory. Streets that had fallen into neglect were repaired under Medici-sponsored construction programs, visible reminders that the family intended to rebuild both stone and spirit. Giuliano's soft-spoken nature became the public face of these reforms, while Giovanni, still in Rome, prepared for his next transformation. In March 1513, Giovanni's election as Pope Leo X carried the family's return beyond Florence. Bankers' sons, once branded as corrupt exiles, now held the papal throne, the ultimate statement of restored power. From his seat in the Vatican, Leo X extended Medici influence across Europe through papal appointments and vast patronage. His papacy funneled resources and prestige back to Florence, linking the city's future with the church itself. The Medici presented their rule not as domination, but as divine providence fulfilled through service and faith. Florentines, even those once skeptical, sensed the inevitability of the dynasty. During the years of exile, families had hidden portraits and coins bearing the Medici crest, keeping them safe until return felt possible. When the brothers re-established control in 1512, those tokens reappeared in homes and workshops as if no time had passed. Loyalty that had gone underground emerged into daylight, and with it, Florence's long partnership between money, art, and religion began anew. From that moment, the Republic was finished in practice, if not in name. Power in Florence once again converged on the Medici. Yet this restored dynasty carried lessons from its downfall: govern quietly, rule through faith, and anchor authority in the structures of culture and belief. As Pope Leo X guided the church from Rome and Giuliano represented the family within Florence's walls, the Medici transformed their comeback into something far greater than political survival. It became a rebirth of their dynasty, positioned at the meeting point of papal ambition, European power, and the city that had always been theirs. In March 1513, Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici rose from the ranks of Florence's exiled bankers to become Pope Leo X, the first member of his family to occupy the papal throne. His coronation represented much more than personal success. It was the ultimate validation of the Medici method, the conversion of money into power, and power into permanence. With the Medici now at the head of the Catholic Church, Florence's influence reached from its narrow city streets to the courts of Europe. The combination of papal authority and the family's financial machinery created a new kind of empire, one built not on conquest, but on credit, diplomacy, and display. Leo X's own words summed up the mood of triumph. Quote, "God has given us the papacy. Now, let us enjoy it." It was not a statement of idleness, but of confidence. He saw no contradiction between faith and magnificence. The Vatican, long a seat of politics and theology, became under his direction a spectacle of artistic achievement. Within months of his election, Leo brought leading artists and thinkers to Rome, transforming the papal court into the beating heart of Renaissance culture. Raphael was commissioned to decorate the papal apartments with harmony and grace that symbolized divine order embodied through art. In the same span of years, Michelangelo received instructions to design the Medici tombs in Florence and contribute to the ongoing construction of St. Peter's Basilica. Under Leo's guidance, Rome presented itself as both eternal city and living gallery, a reflection of the family's belief that beauty validated authority. This cultural revival had clear political logic. A glorious Rome strengthened Leo's hand in negotiations with monarchs who ruled by sword rather than sermon. He reinforced alliances with Francis I of France and carefully maintained communication with Emperor Charles V, ensuring that the Medici position in Tuscany remained secure. Every fresco, ceremony, and architectural project doubled as diplomacy. The Vatican became a stage on which Europe's rulers could witness Medici wealth and refinement, and by extension, their control of taste, knowledge, and loyalty. Yet that pursuit of prestige carried a heavy cost. Leo X's festivals, wars, and artistic ventures consumed resources on an extraordinary scale. The papal treasury, already strained, fell deeper into debt. In search of revenue, the Church expanded its existing system of indulgences, payments said to reduce time in purgatory. The practice was not new, but under Leo's administration, its scale and publicity were unprecedented. He viewed it as practical finance. Many across Europe saw moral decay. The discontent that followed reached Germany, where in 1517, Martin Luther publicly condemned the sale. His 95 Theses drew millions of readers into questioning papal power, initiating what became the Protestant Reformation. Even as the clerical order began to fracture, Leo X maintained his pursuit of spectacle. Banquets and festivals continued, each surpassing the last in expense. It was said that one feast required gold plates so valuable they were melted afterward and recast for later events, a literal reshaping of wealth between courses. For Leo, magnificence remained a language of legitimacy. Yet the grandeur that glorified the Medici name also drained the Vatican's coffers, leaving the institution rich in art but poor in coin. When Leo died in 1521, Europe stood transformed. The Medici had reached their highest influence, commanding the church, guiding Florence from afar, and shaping the culture of an age. Yet they left behind an empty treasury and an uncertain legacy, one soon inherited by his cousin, Lorenzo's nephew, who would become Pope Clement VII. When Pope Leo X died in 1521, the papal throne passed briefly through other hands before settling on another Medici. Giulio de' Medici, cousin to the late pope, had long served as one of the Vatican's most capable administrators. In 1523, he was elected Pope Clement VII, marking the second Medici ascension to the papacy in a single generation. The appointment confirmed that the family still commanded influence at the highest level of the church. Yet Clement's inheritance was far less secure than his cousin's. Europe had become a continent divided by faith, politics, and war, and the authority of Rome, once unquestioned, was under siege from all sides. Clement was cautious by temperament, a man who preferred negotiation to confrontation. He faced an almost impossible task. The Protestant Reformation, ignited 6 years earlier, had already spread across northern Europe, undermining papal control over vast territories. At the same time, the long rivalry between King Francis I of France and Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire fractured the balance of power that held Italy in uneasy peace. Clement attempted to act as mediator, shifting alliances as needed to protect both the Papal States and Florence. His strategy relied on diplomacy in an age losing patience for compromise. Initially, Clement leaned toward France, fearing that an alliance with the Holy Roman Empire would leave the papacy trapped under Habsburg influence. When Francis I was defeated and captured at Pavia in 1525, the Pope found himself forced to reconcile with Charles V to avoid isolation. But upon the French king's release, Clement changed sides again, joining the League of Cognac, a coalition including France, Venice, and Florence, hoping to limit imperial expansion in Italy. These reversals eroded trust on all fronts. By 1527, relations with the emperor had collapsed. The breaking point came when imperial troops stationed in northern Italy mutinied after months without pay. Drawn from Spain, Germany, and the empire's frontier lands, many among them were Protestant soldiers with little reverence for the papal crown. Marching south under the imperial banner but acting on their own desperation, they advanced toward Rome. Discipline disintegrated during the march, and when the army reached the city in May 1527, no one held control. The assault that followed, the sack of Rome, became one of the darkest chapters in Renaissance history. For several days, chaos ruled. The attackers plundered homes, monasteries, and churches. Priceless manuscripts were destroyed and sacred relics desecrated. Thousands of citizens died or were enslaved. The population shrank by nearly half within weeks. The Vatican itself was not spared. Entire collections of art and treasure vanished into the hands of soldiers. Pope Clement fled through a narrow passage to Castel Sant'Angelo, the fortress beside St. Peter's Basilica, where he took refuge for nearly a month. From his high vantage, he watched smoke rise over the city that had once embodied divine authority. When the violence subsided, Clement was a prisoner of circumstance. To secure his release, he paid an immense ransom and accepted the emperor's terms. The political independence of the papacy was effectively broken. Rome's devastation marked the end of the Italian Renaissance's confident optimism. Patronage slowed, artists fled north, and the Roman court turned from celebration to survival. Yet even in this ruin, Clement managed to secure one lasting act of legacy. He arranged the marriage of his niece, Catherine de' Medici, to France's Prince Henry in 1533, a union that would later place a Medici on the French throne. During his confinement, Michelangelo designed hidden passages connecting the Vatican to safer ground, tunnels that still exist today beneath the city. They remain as silent evidence of how close the papacy came to extinction. Clement's reign ended in exhaustion, but ensured that the Medici endured. Their power had shifted from popes back toward princes, a transformation that would shape the family's next chapter. After the devastation of the sack of Rome and years of Italian wars, Florence struggled to define its future. The Republican institutions that once guided the city had eroded beneath foreign influence and internal division. By the mid-16th century, Florence had experimented with every form of government imaginable, communal, theocratic, and dynastic, and none had endured. The experiment ended abruptly in 1537, when Duke Alessandro de' Medici, an illegitimate descendant of Lorenzo the Magnificent, was murdered by a cousin during a private visit. His death left the duchy leaderless and vulnerable to collapse. The Florentine elite, exhausted by instability, needed a successor who appeared pliable enough to control. Their search led to a teenager from a distant branch of the family tree, Cosimo de' Medici, son of the soldier Giovanni della Bandineri and Maria Salviati. Only 17 years old, he arrived in Florence carrying more expectation than authority. The city's ruling families believed they were selecting a figurehead, someone young enough to front their collective power without challenging it. Cosimo accepted quietly, concealing his ambitions behind courteous obedience. Within months, however, he demonstrated a grasp of politics and strategy that stunned the same men who had elevated him. He moved quickly to neutralize opposition, reorganize the army, and secure control of the city's fortresses. A rebellion led by former Republicans erupted at Montemurlo later that year, hoping to overthrow the young duke before his rule solidified. Cosimo's troops crushed the uprising decisively. The victory signaled that Florence's era of fragile republicanism was over. Cosimo understood that strength alone could not secure legitimacy. He turned outward, seeking recognition beyond Florence's borders. Through careful diplomacy, he forged an alliance with Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, whose soldiers dominated much of Italy. By accepting imperial oversight in return for autonomy, Cosimo gained powerful protection. In 1537, Charles confirmed him as Duke of Florence, formally legitimizing his rule. With that recognition, Cosimo began reshaping both government and image. He centralized administration, creating a disciplined bureaucracy that answered only to him. The once rotating councils that had symbolized civic freedom were replaced by appointed officials loyal to ducal interests. To defend his state, Cosimo established a professional army commanded from new fortifications that encircled the city. The transformation was visible everywhere. No longer a bustling republic of merchants debating policy, Florence became an orderly court directed from the Palazzo Vecchio, now the center of government. Cosimo's decision to rule from that building, the former home of the Signoria, fused Florence's republican memory with its autocratic present. Over time, the balance tilted further from city to state. His leadership extended beyond politics into art, architecture, and science. Recognizing culture as an instrument of prestige, Cosimo revived the Medici tradition of patronage under tighter control. Artists and scholars were invited to glorify his court rather than the collective ideals of the past. Chief among them was Giorgio Vasari, whose designs reshaped Florence's landmarks. Cosimo commissioned Vasari to construct new corridors linking palaces and offices, reflecting the efficiency and surveillance of centralized rule. One such project, the Uffizi, was conceived as administrative offices for the Florentine government, the term itself meaning offices. Over the centuries, that structure would evolve into one of the most significant art museums in the world, a product of bureaucratic necessity turned into cultural legacy. By expanding his influence through Tuscany's neighboring territories, Cosimo unified Pisa, Siena, and several smaller states under Florentine oversight. The achievement gave physical shape to what earlier Medicis had only imagined, a regional principality under one banner. His prudence, obedience to the emperor, and commitment to order earned papal approval. In 1569, Pope Pius V granted him the title of Grand Duke of Tuscany, elevating the Medici from urban rulers to hereditary monarchs. Cosimo I's reign marked a new stage in the family's history. From the ashes of republicanism rose a disciplined court whose legitimacy rested on stability and control. Through pragmatic alliances, unrelenting authority, and deliberate presentation, he converted a vulnerable city-state into a durable monarchy. The Medici name, shaped first by banking and art, had now acquired the permanence of royalty. With Cosimo I's coronation as Grand Duke in 1569, the Medici completed their rise from merchants to monarchs. Florence was no longer a self-governed republic, but the capital of a hereditary state recognized across Europe. The transition brought stability to a region that had endured decades of turmoil, and for nearly 2 centuries, Cosimo's descendants would rule over Tuscany. Under their guidance, the small territory became known for careful administration, steady prosperity, and an unusual devotion to science and culture. Each generation of dukes added new dimensions to the Medici reputation, some through vision, others through eccentricity. After Cosimo's death in 1574, his eldest son, Francesco I de' Medici, inherited both the throne and the expectations of reform. Francesco was an intelligent man with a restless curiosity, as fascinated by chemistry as his ancestors had been by politics. The ducal palace turned into part laboratory, part gallery. He financed experiments in metallurgy and distillation, collecting strange minerals and mechanical instruments. Counts describe him conducting demonstrations late into the night, surrounded by flasks, furnaces, and handwritten notes. His interests reached as far as developing an early form of porcelain through secret mixtures of clay and glass, an experiment that centuries later would gain renewed attention for anticipating techniques unknown in Europe at the time. Francesco encouraged painters, engineers, and scholars, but gave little thought to foreign policy or to the management of trade. Without his father's discipline, the state's expansion slowed, and court life became increasingly insular. His marriage to the Venetian noblewoman Bianca Capello, complicated by politics and gossip, only deepened intrigue within the ducal household. When both died suddenly in 1587, rumors spread that they had been poisoned during a family dinner. The cause remains debated, though later studies of their remains have suggested mercury exposure rather than deliberate murder. Even so, the tale of their deaths became part of Medici legend, a mixture of science, secrecy, and fatal curiosity. The next ruler, Ferdinando I, had once been a cardinal in Rome. Leaving the church to take the throne, he brought order back to the government with a sense of purpose. Having observed papal politics firsthand, Ferdinando favored structure over spectacle. He reorganized finances, reformed taxation, and applied practical measures to agriculture. Under his leadership, drainage projects reclaimed marshlands for farming, and irrigation networks improved harvests across the Arno Valley. He founded the port city of Livorno, Leghorn, to attract merchants and sailors from across the Mediterranean. By offering freedom of religion and low customs duties, he drew refugees from Spain, Portugal, and the Ottoman world, turning Livorno into one of Europe's most open ports. Even as commerce expanded, artistic life continued to flourish. The Medici tradition of intellectual patronage extended into the sciences. Galileo Galilei found support among them, famously demonstrating his telescope to Grand Duchess Christina. Their engagement with astronomy, anatomy, and music mirrored the new curiosity of the early modern period. Under Ferdinando and his successors, opera took shape in Florence's theaters, merging poetry, performance, and sound in an art form that would spread throughout Europe. By the late 17th century, the court had settled into comfortable elegance. The Florentine press published treatises on mechanics and optics, while foreign diplomats marveled at the duchy's libraries and workshops. Yet the later Medici lacked the drive of their founders. Politically cautious and devoted to personal study, they preferred stability to ambition. The duchy remained peaceful but inward-looking, more museum than power. The dynasty still commanded respect, but each generation produced fewer heirs, and the line that had once reshaped Europe faced its quietest challenge, continuing its legacy without successors. From their earliest rise in Florence, the Medici treated knowledge as an investment. Wealth could build palaces, but learning built permanence, something that could outlast rulers and boundaries. Their patronage turned Florence into a workshop of discovery where creativity and inquiry worked side by side. Under the Medici dukes, this partnership matured into a system. Artists, scientists, and philosophers worked not in isolation, but in conversation, each discipline advancing the other. What began as a private family tradition evolved into public institutions that defined the intellectual life of Europe. Cosimo I formalized that approach by establishing the Accademia del Disegno, the first academy dedicated to the theory and practice of art. Until then, painters and sculptors had belonged to craft guilds alongside stonemasons and carpenters. The academy changed that perception, recognizing artists as thinkers who could study proportion, anatomy, and geometry with academic rigor. This shift elevated art from manual labor to intellectual pursuit. Training was standardized, criticism encouraged, and the study of the human body connected the visual arts to the emerging field of science. The Medici used these new frameworks to reinforce Florence's reputation as the heart of Renaissance thought. Their influence reached further as later dukes continued sponsoring scholars beyond the arts. Mathematicians, engineers, and natural philosophers found steady support within the Medici court. Workshops attached to the ducal palace became laboratories filled with maps, globes, and mechanical clocks. Anatomists, careful in their dissection of the human form, stood beside architects studying structural balance. This network of disciplines placed Florence in direct conversation with the scientific centers of Venice and Padua, and its findings traveled through Europe in manuscripts and diagrams financed by Medici funds. Curiosity itself had become state policy. No example of this blend of curiosity and patronage stands out more than the connection between the Medici and Galileo Galilei. When Galileo presented his telescopic observations to the ducal court, he understood the importance of association. He named Jupiter's 4 largest moons the Medicean stars, honoring his patrons and acknowledging their role in supporting his study. The discovery symbolized a new relationship between science and power, evidence and observation funded by rank and reputation. While controversy followed in later years, the partnership demonstrated how a Florentine lineage rooted in commerce had evolved into allies of scientific transformation. The family's support also extended to medicine, alchemy, and the exploration of natural phenomena. Laboratories within the Pitti Palace examined minerals, plants, and chemical reactions, not only for curiosity's sake, but for their potential in trade and healing. Grand Duke Ferdinando II continued this focus through organized experimentation in thermodynamics and climate. Under his patronage, Florence witnessed the creation of the mercury thermometer, a tool that made temperature a measurable concept rather than a feeling. That practical achievement revealed how the Medici viewed experimentation as an extension of policy and patronage, binding scientific precision to civic progress. While scientific inquiry thrived, the Medici maintained their allegiance to the arts. Masters such as Caravaggio, Vasari, and Bronzino found their work intertwined with the family's pursuit of learning. Paintings celebrated invention, architecture embodied order, and music explored harmony as a reflection of cosmic balance. Within the court, musicians and philosophers mingled with engineers, and performances mirrored experiments. Out of this environment, opera emerged. The earliest performances combined poetry, instrumental composition, and staging under ducal sponsorship in Florence. The term opera, meaning work, reflected the Medici view that every creative act, artistic or scientific, was labor in service of knowledge. Through generations of careful support, the Medici knit together the intellectual threads that would later form the foundation of modern Europe. Their workshops anticipated laboratories, their academies shaped universities, and their salons foreshadowed modern research institutions. By the time their political strength began to fade, their influence over how knowledge was produced had already taken root. Florence, once a city of traders, had become a place where art and science merged into lasting legacy, preserved long after the family's own line began to fade. By the late 17th century, the Medici family that had once steered the engines of culture and politics across Europe was entering its final era. The dynasty remained rich, surrounded by masterpieces, villas, and the prestige of centuries, but it was a hollow inheritance. The confidence that had carried their ancestors to power through banking, diplomacy, and art had given way to fatigue. The Medici were still revered, their portraits still displayed in Florence, yet the fire that once drove them to shape history was fading. Wealth had survived, vitality had not. The long decline revealed itself most clearly under Grand Duke Cosimo III de' Medici, who ruled from 1670 to 1723. He was meticulous and deeply religious, a man of strict habits and conservative outlook. His court followed rigid codes of conduct that discouraged the lively discussion and humanist curiosity that had defined earlier generations. While Cosimo's piety was sincere, it created a climate that suffocated innovation. His administration imposed heavy taxes to sustain the court and army, draining the economy without investing in commercial growth. A combination of war, famine, and taxation slowed Florence's population, and the once busy workshops that had served the Renaissance emptied into silence. Trade across Tuscany declined as neighboring states drew merchants and craftsmen away. The Arno's ports, once filled with voices from across the Mediterranean, echoed with reduced traffic. Even the city's artists turned inward, producing pious themes rather than bold experimentation. Foreign observers noted that Florence appeared beautifully preserved yet curiously lifeless, a city that had become a museum to itself. Cosimo III viewed moral order as Florence's highest mission. He banned certain public entertainments and emphasized discipline among the clergy, measures that reflected his belief in moral purity but further suppressed what remained of civic energy. Within the ducal palace, family tensions grew. The Grand Duke quarreled with his children and saw no capable heir ready to restore confidence. His eldest son predeceased him, leaving the younger, Giovanni de' Medici, to inherit the throne. Where Cosimo had been strict, Giovanni was withdrawn. He assumed power in 1723 with little enthusiasm, already burdened by illness and disillusionment. The decline of trade, exhausted finances, and loss of imperial influence left him a ruler of ceremony more than authority. He spent most days in seclusion, turning to books and conversation with a small circle of companions while delegating governance to ministers. Court life dwindled during his 14-year reign. The elaborate banquets, performances, and diplomatic gatherings that once showcased Medici prestige disappeared. Musicians went unpaid, and the academies founded by his ancestors struggled to find patronage. The great residences, Pitti, Petraea, and Poggio a Caiano, stood half-used, their halls preserved carefully but without purpose. Wealth remained, but the dynamism that had given the Medici meaning was gone. The army shrank to a token force, and foreign powers quietly negotiated the future of Tuscany in anticipation of Gian Gastone's eventual death. When that moment came in 1737, the end arrived without ceremony. Gian Gastone died childless, closing the direct Medici male line after nearly 3 centuries. True to his withdrawn nature, he requested no public funeral. The city mourned privately as Austria confirmed its acquisition of the duchy. Power transferred to Francis Stephen of Lorraine, husband of Maria Theresa of Austria, marking the beginning of Habsburg rule in Tuscany. Yet even stripped of sovereignty, the Medici name retained unmatched resonance in Europe. Their dynasty had reshaped culture, economics, and science so completely that its decline felt less like disappearance than transformation. And in Florence, one final descendant would ensure that the memory of their age never vanished. When her brother Gian Gastone de' Medici died in 1737, Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici became the last living descendant of a family that had ruled, inspired, and financed Florence for 3 centuries. She was 60 years old, intelligent, and well-educated, aware that the dynasty's extinction was not only biological, but symbolic. Without her, the lineage that had produced popes, dukes, scientists, and artists would end completely. For most of her life, she had lived away from Tuscany as the wife of Johann Wilhelm, Elector Palatine of the Rhine. In Germany, she earned a reputation as an accomplished patron of music, supporting composers and sponsoring public concerts in Dusseldorf. Widowed and without children, she returned to Florence after decades abroad to find a city ruled by outsiders and a patrimony in danger of neglect. When the Austrians assumed authority over Tuscany and granted administration to the House of Lorraine, Florence's new rulers saw the Medici collections mainly as valuables rather than heritage. The treasures accumulated over generations, from ancient bronzes and rare manuscripts to canvases by the masters of the Renaissance, could easily have been dispersed through sale or diplomatic exchange. Anna Maria Luisa understood the risk clearly. She had grown up surrounded by those objects and the memory of what they represented, her family's long experiment linking beauty with civic pride. In her view, the artworks were not property, but identity. Their protection became her final project. To secure that goal, she turned to legal strategy. Negotiations with the new government were delicate, as she no longer held political authority, yet retained symbolic control over all Medici possessions inherited from her ancestors. After years of discussion, she drafted an agreement known as the Patto di Famiglia, the Family Pact, ratified in 1743. This document stated that the entire artistic, archival, and scientific patrimony collected by the Medici must remain in Florence, quote, for the use of the public and the glory of the city. With those words, Anna Maria Luisa transformed a private dynasty's collection into a civic trust. The scale of what she secured is difficult to overstate. The contents of the Uffizi Gallery, the Pitti Palace, and the Medici Villa collections included masterpieces by Michelangelo, Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, Titian, and countless others. By preventing these works from being divided among European courts, she preserved the essence of the Renaissance in its birthplace. Within a generation, travelers from across the continent came to Florence not to witness a royal court, but to study an open treasury of art, science, and history. The city evolved into a living museum, its cultural wealth serving both memory and monument. Anna Maria Luisa continued to manage the maintenance of these institutions until her health declined. She recorded inventories, oversaw restoration projects, and corresponded with scholars regarding the care of manuscripts and instruments. Her intention was never display alone, but education, the same principle her forebears had followed when they sponsored artists and thinkers to elevate civic life. The terms of her family pact remain legally binding to this day. No major artwork from the Medici holdings can be permanently removed from Florence. She died in 1743, 6 years after her brother, bringing the Medici bloodline to its quiet close. Yet the act she signed ensured that Florence retained the heart of its history. Through a single decision, she succeeded where wars and princes had failed, preserving the achievements of her family not as relics of rule, but as a public inheritance. Anna Maria Luisa showed that legacy could outlast lineage. Through her will and intellect, the Medici presence would remain part of Florence forever. After 3 centuries of ambition, invention, and political mastery, the Medici left Florence with something far greater than material wealth. They gave the city an identity built on intellect and creativity. Under their patronage, a modest trade republic evolved into a center of world influence where art, science, and politics merged into a durable legacy. Florence under the Medici became a civic experiment that defined what a culture could achieve when talent met resources. Their history reads as an outline for the modern state, its values still visible in the rhythm of city life and the ideas that developed there. The transformation began with an understanding that beauty and knowledge could serve as instruments of power. The Medici used their fortune not simply to decorate their surroundings, but to build an environment that produced thinking minds. Architects, sculptors, and scholars gathered in Florence because the family created conditions for new work to thrive. From Brunelleschi's dome crowning the cathedral to Botticelli's Birth of Venus and Michelangelo's David, each masterpiece carried with it a record of civic pride. These were not isolated triumphs, but part of a deliberate program that joined art with identity. In doing so, the Medici taught Europe that creative achievement could legitimize authority as surely as ancestry. Their wealth as bankers provided that foundation. Through it, they financed what today would be called public infrastructure, libraries, academies, and universities. These institutions turned Florence into a classroom for the continent, spreading ideas of humanism and logical inquiry. The influence extended far beyond painting or sculpture, entering the realms of philosophy, theology, and economic theory. The use of credit and double-entry bookkeeping perfected under Medici supervision allowed merchants to plan, cities to grow, and states to manage debt with sophistication previously unseen. Their economic innovation became the hidden skeleton that supported Renaissance culture. Curiosity anchored their power as much as coins did. Later generations turned their attention to the natural world, fostering early stages of the scientific revolution. Figures like Galileo Galilei found in the Medici a source of stability that made discovery possible. By supporting his telescopic research, the family sponsored a shift from inherited authority to observation-based knowledge. Their backing extended to Evangelista Torricelli, who refined measurements of air pressure, and Francesco Redi, whose controlled experiments challenged accepted ideas about life itself. The Medici court, though political, functioned as a scientific workshop where evidence replaced superstition. Intellect shaped their diplomacy as well. Medici rulers balanced ambition with subtlety, mastering the negotiations that allowed a single city-state to survive among empires. Their style of governance influenced Niccolò Machiavelli, whose writings examined how power could be maintained through perception and adaptability, concepts drawn from close observation of their rule. Even long after the dynasty's decline, European statesmen copied the efficiency of their patronage model, blending culture and bureaucracy to legitimize authority. The foresight of Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici ensured that this collective achievement did not disperse with the extinction of the family line. Her family pact bound the treasures of Florence to the city itself, transforming private wealth into a permanent public trust. Because of that act, the Uffizi Gallery, the Pitti Palace, the Palazzo Vecchio, and the Medici chapels still hold the evidence of their vision. Every visitor walking beneath Brunelleschi's dome or across the Ponte Vecchio continues to encounter the reach of that legacy. The family's coat of arms, the 6 red spheres, remains embedded in doorways and fountains, a quiet reminder that Florence's identity was built through their decisions. The Medici story endures not as a tale of domination, but of ideas converted into structure. Their rule faded, but the empire they imagined, founded on culture, curiosity, and intellect, still governs how the world defines civilization. When the Medici line ended in 1743, its influence did not. The family's power structure had already become the scaffolding for modern life. Their approach to influence, relying on intellect, finance, and patronage instead of armies, reshaped how the Western world measured authority. Banking had been their weapon, but ideas became their legacy. The Medici example proved that control could come from shaping minds rather than borders. Across Europe, rulers and merchants studied their methods, applying lessons drawn from a dynasty that had made prosperity itself a political tool. In Florence, the foundation they left behind remained visible in every institution. Their economic innovations evolved into modern financial systems, where letters of exchange replaced coinage as the language of commerce. The Medici Bank's introduction of double-entry bookkeeping provided transparency that made large-scale credit possible for the first time. That practice, created out of necessity to track the family's global transactions, became the cornerstone of capitalism. Through these systems, economies could expand safely, and trade gained a sense of mathematical certainty that transformed markets from Venice to Antwerp. The quiet precision of ledger books achieved what weapons had not: stability grounded in trust. Beyond the counting houses, their patronage of learning had equally deep effects. By funding figures like Marsilio Ficino, they helped popularize humanism, a movement that placed rational study and individual insight above superstition. That intellectual shift rippled through education, encouraging inquiry not as rebellion, but as civic duty. That same philosophy later guided Galileo Galilei's astronomical research, which challenged inherited wisdom with measured observation. When Galileo named Jupiter's largest moons after his patrons, he acknowledged the link between curiosity and the power that sustained it. Ideas, once confined to universities, entered laboratories and observatories, creating the architecture of the scientific revolution. Art carried their influence even farther. Painters such as Botticelli and sculptors inspired by the Medici vision had redefined how beauty expressed civic values. Their work continued to shape European taste long after the commissions ended. The architecture of Florence, its domes, courtyards, and symmetrical facades, became a pattern for cities across the continent. Urban planners used these principles as templates for capital design, translating Medici harmony into civic order. Museums, too, followed their lead. The Uffizi Gallery, organized under Medici oversight, became the prototype for displaying art as public heritage rather than private possession. Their methods of rule inspired political theory as well. Niccolò Machiavelli observed their ability to balance mercy with manipulation, using persuasion and perception to hold a divided city together. His reflections in The Prince distilled those observations into study, spreading the Medici approach to governance through every generation of statesmen that followed. The family's blend of commerce and culture offered an early model for the modern city-state, where economic vitality, artistic achievement, and administrative discipline reinforced each other as parts of a single system. Dynastic connections carried their name beyond Italy. Catherine de' Medici's marriage into the French royal family extended their influence into the politics of Northern Europe, intertwining Florentine pragmatism with continental monarchy. Architectural designs exported by their engineers informed French palaces and Austrian gardens, transforming aristocratic taste. The Medici legacy even reached beyond Earth. NASA named a crater on the moon Medici in recognition of their role as patrons of scientific discovery. Today, traces of their philosophy remain in common practice. Endowments, scholarships, and research grants reflect the Medici principle that wealth achieves permanence through education and innovation. Every gallery that preserves art for public study, every university funded by private benefactors, follows a method they perfected. From traders in wool to founders of the Renaissance, the Medici demonstrated that progress depends not on conquest, but on imagination disciplined by reason. Their rise and endurance prove that power rooted in thought, once established, never disappears, it evolves. From bankers to kings, the Medici didn't just rule Florence, they reinvented civilization. Their art, ideas, and ambition shaped the world we still live in today. If you enjoyed this journey through history, subscribe, drop a like, and stay tuned for more stories that built our world.